Technology. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of all of us here at the Texas Demographic Center, we welcome each of you joining us in person this morning and online for our annual demographic conference. My name is Monica Cruz, and I serve as the State Data Center Lead for the Texas Demographic Center. This is the first time we take our conference on the road, and we're thrilled to be here in Dallas, meeting with some fascinating movers and shakers in the North Texas region and across the state. We're especially grateful to our conference host, One Star, and our sponsors, Texas Rural Funders, Water Cooler at Pegasus Park, and the Dallas Foundation. Your support has certainly made our conference a success. Thank you. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Texas Demographic Center is the state data center for Texas, and we are a member of the U.S. Census Bureau's State Data Center Network. We function as a focal point for the production, interpretation, and distribution of demographic information for Texas. We also produce and disseminate population estimates and projections for the state, as well as other demographic information. Special emphasis is placed on data that may be useful to policymakers at the local, county, and regional levels regarding the demand for state services and other resources. We're kicking our conference off with some fascinating speakers this morning, and I have the pleasure of introducing our Texas State Demographer, Dr. Lloyd Potter. Dr. Potter was appointed State Demographer on June 4th of 2010. He holds a PhD in Demography and Sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, a Master of Public Health degree from Emory University, a Master of Science in Education from the University of Houston at Clear Lake, and a Bachelor of Science from Texas A&M University. He's a professor in the Department of Demography at the University of Texas in San Antonio, where he also serves as the director of the Institute for Demographic and Socioeconomic Research, which we call as IDSER at UTSA. He has extensive experience working as an applied demographer in several settings and was recently appointed to serve on the National Academy of Sciences National Committee on Statistics. He will give our State of the State presentation, demographic trends, and characteristics in Texas. So joining me and welcoming Dr. Potter.
Thank you, Monica. Well, good morning. It's good to be with you all today. Thanks for coming out. I'm going to go through a fair amount and give you a pretty good picture, I think, of things that are happening demographically in the state. So I'll mainly focus initially on demographic change, but then I'll shift a little bit to talk about some social and economic issues as well. Whoop. There we go. So first up is Texas is growing a lot. In fact, we're growing more than any other state. And we have been for some time. So if you kind of look at that red line there, you can, yep, still one. I'm kind of trying to figure out this little monitor down here. So the red line certainly indicates that Texas has been adding more population than any other state, and that's kind of been happening for some time. When we look at population change, just kind of, okay, there we go. Put the mic over here. Okay. All right, we got it now. All right, so if we look at the Texas, you can see we're now at over 31 million Texans. We're growing more than any other state, so we're adding more population than any other state, which is the first slide I just showed. And then we're also growing fast, which is kind of hard to do when you're as big as Texas because our denominator is really large. And so we're adding a lot of people, but the percent change is quite significant. So we're the second most significant, most rapidly growing state in the country. If we look at one of the things we do is estimate the number of new Texans each day. And so if you look there at the bottom, actually last decade between 2010 and 2020, we were growing at about 1,000 Texans per day. Between 2020 and 2021, we were down to 900. That was a function of the pandemic, essentially. Migration really slowed pretty dramatically that year. We also saw an increase in deaths and a slight decline in births happening that year as well. When we look at the next year, all of a sudden it's back up beyond 1,000 per day, where we're almost at 1,500 per day. And then the next year, 16, and now this most recent year, we're at 1,500 per day. So that's a lot. And again, it's more than what we were experiencing last decade on average. And we certainly have recovered from the pandemic in terms of demographic change. When we look at the distribution of the population in the state, you can see that we have what we refer to as the demographic or population triangle, with the Dallas-Fort Worth at the top point, and San Antonio, Austin, bottom left, and Houston in the right. This is where most of the growth activity is happening in the state. So there's well, I'll talk a little bit about population change out west, but essentially the population in the western part of the state is much more sparse, and the dynamics are such that we actually have a fair amount of counties that are losing population. When we look at population change, you can see again, the population triangle points is where most of that change is occurring. You can see that Harris County, or Houston, was the most significant growing county in the country, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you look at all the suburban ring counties around the urban cores, you see pretty dramatic increases in population, and that is accelerating. And when I drill down and look a little bit closer at smaller geographies, you'll see kind of where that growth is occurring. When we look at counties and the population change, you can see Harris County was the most significant growing county in the country. And that's interesting because it had net out domestic migration. So there are more people, domestic migrants, moving out of the Houston area than are moving in. That is being more than offset by international migration. So people moving into Texas from other countries and landing in Harris County. And then, of course, Harris County also has a relatively young population, so fewer deaths and a fair number of people, significant number of people in the childbearing years. So we're seeing natural change or natural increase being a significant factor of growth there. But what's also interesting, if you kind of look at those little red boxes, we have these significant growing counties that have net out domestic migration. So and interestingly, Tarrant County, which is was the 10th most significant growing county in the country. And actually, Fort Worth was up. You'll see when I start talking about places, Fort Worth was up at the top in terms of population change, but it has net out domestic migration. Of course, that's being offset quite significantly by international migration, and it certainly has a very significant natural increase as well. And then if you look at Dallas, Dallas has net out and has been having net out domestic migration as Harris County for almost a decade, if not a little bit longer. In Dallas County, the international migration is barely offsetting the domestic migration outflow. So really, Dallas County is growing pretty much from natural change. Because again, if it wasn't experiencing international migration, it would have a net outflow of migrants. But the international migration is somewhat offsetting that a little bit. And then, of course, Travis County, Austin, has had net out domestic migration. And that's a fairly new thing as well. And so one of the things that I think is happening in these counties is essentially they're urban core counties. Land use is pretty well been determined in these counties, so there's very little opportunities for additional housing to be built. And if there is housing being built, it's kind of tends to be more expensive to build, or they're also gentrifying or kind of increasing the density of housing, and that's also expensive. So the net result of that, and Austin I think is a great case here. the price of housing is really expensive. And in addition to that, the population is much more dense, and so that probably has some impact on quality of life in terms of traffic and things like that. And then we also had the pandemic, and that kind of has changed our work behaviors, where we have a lot of people that are able to work remotely now. And so if you're living in Austin and paying a lot for your mortgage or for your rent, and you can work remotely, but you could go live out in the hill country somewhere, um, buy a bigger house for a lot less money, have land, less overall higher quality of life. So we think that's a factor that's happening. And actually, I'm not going to present this today, but we did look at Dallas and looked at where the domestic migrants are going. Essentially, they're going to the suburban ring counties. Um, Very few of them are kind of going much further out, or the bulk of the domestic migrants are moving into Collin County and Denton and so on. Okay. So here is, oh, I did put this in here. Is this the right slide deck? I think this is the wrong slide deck. I gave a presentation yesterday, and this looks a whole lot like the one I gave yesterday. So somehow I think we got them mixed up. Okay. So what I was just talking about, because this is what I talked about yesterday, you can see here that uh, so this is the flow of migrants. So you see people coming from out of state into the Dallas area, and then when we look at where the net outflows are, there's all the suburban ring counties, and almost all of them are kind of right around Dallas, except for Fort Bend, and that's kind of the smaller one. When we look at population change for cities, you can see that Houston was the most significant growing city in the country, San Antonio second, and Fort Worth third. So that's pretty significant in terms of population change and kind of the fact that the top four most significant growing counties are in Texas, places are in Texas. Um, how's it going back there? Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Um, let's see. So this just kind of showing you a map of the cities and numeric change. You can see that I think Frisco and McKinney are kind of really significant in terms of growth, but you also see Dallas and Fort Worth having very significant growth as well. When we look at percent change, population change, you can see the highest percent change is in the suburban ring counties. So if you look at the Dallas area, kind of look at all the dark green counties around Dallas County and Tarrant County. Again, the population there is growing very quickly because one, people are moving out of the urban cores into those counties, but the people that are coming into Texas from other counties outside of the urban area are moving to those suburban ring counties. And then also from out of state and international migrants are also moving into those areas as well. So those are the places where we're seeing, the real stress occurring on the infrastructure because there's so many people that are moving there that, they're having to build roads, they're having to build housing, retail, schools, um, distribute power, water, so on and so forth. All of that takes time and it definitely has an impact on quality of life for a little while until it kind of gets settled. When we look at percent change, um, you can see that the counties that are the most rapid growing, a fair number of them are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but almost all of those counties that are growing quickly are in these suburban ring areas that I was just talking about. And if you look at the growth, the components of population change, that last column there, you can see the growth is really being driven by domestic migration in the suburban ring counties. So essentially, oh, say what? Okay, this is where I was. Okay. So I'll kind of have to, all right, thank you. Okay, again, you see a very significant driver of fast growth is domestic migration. Here we're looking at the percent change for cities, and you can see all of the cities, many of them, Princeton, Salina. I got it right. Okay, Anna, Hutto, Roy City, all are kind of in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, just very rapid and significant growth occurring in those areas. And again, leading the country in terms of rapid growth. Many of the cities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but other urbanized areas in Texas as well. So this highlights components of population change at the county level and what's the driver of that population change. So if you look at all of the blue counties there, largely on the east side of the state, their growth is being driven by migration, and most of those is domestic migration. And then if you look at the west side of the state, you kind of see a slightly different scenario where you actually have net out migration, and we have a fair number of counties that also have natural decrease, more deaths than births. And so young people age up through in the rural areas, age up through high school, and then if they want to go to post-secondary or find a work, they may need to actually move out of their home county and probably into one of the more urbanized areas in the eastern part of the state. And then the people that are left behind are their parents and grandparents. And then the people that aren't there having babies are those young people that moved away. So they're having their babies in the more urbanized areas, and you have an aging population in rural Texas, so you end up having more deaths than births in some of these counties. And usually that occurs after there's been this net that usually is in combination with net outflow of migrants, causing the population to get older, and then consequently higher mortality. Um, and then where are Texas domestic migrants coming from? And I probably should have asked that question before I put the slide up, because I'm sure everybody would have said California, because that seems to be a lot of complaints about Californians coming to Texas. Yesterday we had a session, and one we were kind of joking a little bit about the people that move into the state should we need to figure out how to make them into Texans somehow. So, and we were kind of saying, well, let's if you move in here, you get a cowboy hat, some boots, and a truck. So that's a requirement before you actually cross the border to, and I don't know if that would keep some people away, but I think people would probably like that. So you can see, again, California is our net biggest sender. New York is the next biggest sender. And then Louisiana has historically been a big sender of domestic migrants to Texas. Florida's up there as well. Okay, so now I'm going to shift a little bit, and I think I might have missed. I can't remember if I missed some slides there. I probably did. Okay. Um, so if we look at the percent of housing units built, that's a very good indicator of population change because, of course, if you have people moving there, you need new housing units. If you look at the counties are around the points of the demographic triangle. That's where the most housing units are being built. You can also see out in West Texas in the Permian Basin significant growth as well. Um, and so this is really just an indication of the growth that's occurred over the last decade and a half, and where that's occurring. Now I'm going to zoom in here and look at census tracts, and so you can kind of see the areas that have older housing stock essentially are the yellow census tracts, and those that have newer housing stock are the red ones. And so you can see the urban cores, they're not adding new housing. Um, and so the new housing is really being added in these suburban rings. And so you'll see as I go through a couple of other urbanized areas, there's a sort of concentric pattern of development that's occurring. So, as more and more people come, there's pressure for more and more development occurring further and further out. And of course, in the urban core, you can't add new housing or it's really hard to. So essentially, the housing is happening out in the suburban ring counties. And that's also where the housing is going to be more affordable. And another element of this is that oftentimes the school districts in the suburban ring counties are better than they are in the urban cores. And so families that have kids are going to be looking for what they consider to be the best school districts, and they'll kind of target those areas to move into those areas. And again, that's often combined with more affordable housing, more house for your money, so to speak. Here's the Houston area. Again, you can kind of see that concentric pattern. So you can see Fort Bend. Waller is now really picking up growth and then kind of going up north into Montgomery County. And then the DFW area, you can kind of see all, again, really up north and north, a little bit northwest in Tarrant County. Very significant growth occurring. And then this is just kind of highlighting the Permian Basin because that's an area where we're seeing very significant growth occurring largely because of the oil extraction. But you can actually, if you go up and look at Lubbock, you see there's some significant growth occurring there in the southwestern part of Lubbock County. One of the things that we've seen really with the recession, the 2007, 2008 recession, was declining birth rates. And here we're looking at race and ethnic specific birth rates. You can see the Hispanic population birth rates have declined very dramatically since the recession, and that kind of continued through most of last decade. And then we had the pandemic, and that kind of slowed things. Then we've seen a little bit of an uptick for Hispanics and for the non-Hispanic white coming out of the pandemic. We'll see what happens going forward, but that's something we're watching very closely because this is a very significant element of estimating population as well as projecting population because we'll look at trends, fertility trends, and then we carry those forward. And so we're thinking that eventually the Hispanic population will probably come down to close to parity with the other race ethnic groups. So we're kind of trending them in that direction. But you see this little uptick at the end there, and so we're kind of wondering, okay, is that kind of going to be a trend now, or is it going to kind of go up and then come back down and come into similar rates as the other race ethnic groups? So this is happening largely because women are delaying childbearing. So if you kind of look here, you can see in 2000 that more of the births were happening to younger women compared to 2019. So you can see that, and in fact, in 2019, if you look at the older women, the number of births is higher than it was in 2009. And so delayed childbearing means that each woman is going to have fewer children over her childbearing years. And the net result of that is birth rates are lower. And that's something that will have significant impacts for us going forward. Here's looking at Hispanic birth rates and looking at them over time by age. And so what's interesting here is that you can see that the essentially the older women are having more babies more recently compared to historically for Hispanics. So again, a lot of the decline in fertility that we're seeing is being driven by declining birth rates among Hispanics. And much of that has to do with delayed childbearing, which and I'll talk a little bit about some of the implications of this for our age structure and so on. But essentially, it's probably a good news story, even though you can kind of put a spin on it like, well, it might have some impact on us economically with declining size of cohorts, birth cohorts. Um, but um, but essentially, what it implies is that young Hispanic women are finishing school and they're employed. Um, and that's very strongly associated with delayed childbearing. So if you get a bachelor's degree or master's degree or PhD, you're going to probably not be really focused on having a lot of kids because we know that kids take a lot of time and effort. And if you're in school, it's kind of, and I can say that teaching, I have students that have kids, and they definitely have some challenges in terms of keeping up with everything in their life, and including their classwork. Um, and so essentially, it's probably a pretty good news story in terms of the economic development of young Hispanic women. And so here's two population pyramids, the 2010 and 2020. And if you look here, you can see at the bottom of the population pyramid, those children that were 0 to 1 in 2010 are 10 years old in 2020. And if you look at the bottom of the 2020 population pyramid, you can see it's indented. It's very closely aligned with what I was just showing you in terms of birth rates. So we're seeing that, and so that will stay with us. Those cohorts are not going to get any bigger unless people move here. So it's not so the natural increase component of population change in Texas has slowed pretty dramatically, and it's having an impact on our age structure. And so those young kids are going to age up. So they'll kind of, if you think about a rat and a snake or something like that, you kind of the young people will age up. Um, and as they do that, you'll have these indentations. And if birth rates continue to stay low, we may see this indentation continue to get smaller and smaller at the bottom. So we could even have an inverted population pyramid at some point. And there are some countries that actually have that. So if you think about the impact of that, we're already seeing it. I don't know if you're familiar with, especially with urban school districts. You're seeing a lot of them closing campuses, consolidating campuses, and that's happening because there aren't as many kids that are coming into school. Again, largely in the urban core areas. The areas that are growing a lot from migration, domestic migration, they're continuing to grow. Their schools are continuing to be enrolled fully, and they're actually adding new school districts, new school buildings, and so on. And so the impact of this is clearly the school districts are going to be impacted. So we have less demand for schools, but eventually these kids are going to age into the college going years. So it might have an impact on our universities. We're seeing that already around the country in terms of enrollment in colleges and universities because Texas is kind of late to the game in terms of lower birth rates. And um, uh, and so we're seeing declining enrollment in many other states, and we're likely to see that in Texas. We're also it's also resulting in competition for universities in Texas because all the places that are experiencing declining enrollment are offering great scholarships and things for students in Texas to come to their colleges and universities. Okay, I'm going to move along here pretty quickly now. So rural counties, you can see we have out of our 254 counties, 181 defined as rural being 50,000 or less. And so certainly you can see much of that is in West Texas, but we also have some in East and Central Texas as well. And that here we're kind of looking at at internet access. And certainly Texas has made a big push to try to expand the infrastructure to enable internet access. Actually, I just saw somewhere where some of the federal funding for broadband access has kind of been cut, I think. So that progress that we have been seeing is likely to slow a little bit here for a while. But it's a big issue, especially in the rural parts of the state, getting access to the internet. Um, Here's looking at disability. One of the things with an aging population is so you can see certainly the aged population is more likely to be disabled. And here we're kind of highlighting the differences between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites. That Hispanics have a greater proportion of the population that is disabled compared to non-Hispanic whites. Um, but that's something that's going to continue in Texas. We're getting older. I mean, I was just showing you the declining number of children that we're having. But the baby boom age generation is now kind of moving into the high disability years, or as many of them are already in those years. And so that's going to be a continuing challenge for Texas in terms of ensuring accessibility and ensuring that people with disabilities have access to services. Infant mortality, we see higher infant mortality among African Americans. But the good news is that we're seeing declines in infant mortality for all race ethnic groups. So we are doing, I think, making some good progress here in terms of infant mortality. Of course, for the African American population, we need to do a lot more. Um, Health insurance. Texas has the highest proportion of the population not having health insurance. And then if you can look to see where that is occurring, the lower Rio Grande Valley, and then much of the rural parts of the state don't have access to or don't have health insurance. Um, and then these are children without health insurance. We'll kind of move on through that. And then by race and ethnicity, we see significant differentials, especially for Hispanic, African American, and then two or more races. You know, significant proportions of those populations that don't have health insurance. When we look at diabetes, diabetes is one of our biggest challenges in Texas and probably in many other states as well. But certainly we have challenges in terms of obesity and diabetes. And we're seeing that higher and higher proportions of the population being diabetic. So thinking back to the disability slide I was just highlighting, again, we're likely to have increased demand for healthcare, providing healthcare to people that are diabetic and kind of all the complications that come with that. When we look at the health care and mental health care workforce, you can see that for physicians, there are a fair number of counties that don't have any physicians. Again, all of those are rural counties, but then also pretty sparse availability of physicians. And so if you're living in a rural part of the state, you may have difficulty even getting appointments with physicians because the demand is there because there are fewer physicians and the demand is high, and so it's really difficult to get access. And then when we look at mental health, much of the rural parts of the state, again, have very little access to mental health care. When we look at poverty and look at this by age, you can see that we're doing better for everybody except for the aged population. Some of this we speculate may have to do with a lot of the efforts that occurred following the pandemic or coming out of the pandemic. There was a lot of resources that went to families to try to help them during the pandemic. So we think that might have something to do with the declining rates. And so we'll be watching this going forward to see what happens with it. But certainly looking at the population that is 65 years of age and older, if you kind of think about health insurance, you think about these are people that are retiring, that and they don't have resources for their daily activities and so on, it's going to be increasingly a challenge as we have more and more of our population that's 65 and older. Uh, Educational attainment by race and ethnicity. Hispanic population has pretty dramatically lower levels of educational attainment or smaller numbers of higher levels of educational attainment than all other race ethnic groups. The Hispanic population is the largest race ethnic group in the state. I think about 40% of our population is now Hispanic, more Hispanics than non-Hispanic whites. And that's going to continue that trend. We'll see fewer and fewer non-Hispanic whites at some point. Uh, and um, and the Hispanic population will continue to grow. And if we don't, we have been making progress, and I'm not going to go into this because we are making progress with educational attainment for Hispanics and African Americans. But the question is it going to be enough? Are we going to be able to ensure that our workforce has the skills that we need in Texas? Because we are certainly growing economically. A lot of higher skilled, higher paid jobs are being created in the state. And the question is, are we going to fill those with people from Texas? And again, largely people that are of Hispanic descent. Or are we going to continue to import skilled labor? So if you look at domestic migrants, generally speaking, domestic migrants have higher levels of educational attainment, higher levels of income, and so on than the population in Texas. So I do think one of our big challenges is, and has been for some time, addressing the issue of lower levels of educational attainment among Hispanics. Um, okay, talking about the future. So we fairly recently have released our 2024 population projections. We have, you can see the gray dotted line there is our 2022 projections. And so if you look at the red line in the middle, that's the mid-level migration scenario. That's basically what we think things are going to happen. The blue line is higher migration scenario, and the green line is a lower migration scenario. Um, and you can see that the impact of we think this is largely an impact of declining birth rates in terms of the projected being a little bit lower than our 2022 projections when we look at the mid migration scenario. Where is the population change going to occur, the projected? You can see that the population triangles continue to be a driver of our population growth. If you look at Denton and Collin counties, just kind of continuing to grow much more significantly and more rapidly than Tarrant and Dallas County. And then, of course, San Antonio. But if you look at Williamson County, just north of Austin, and then Harris County and Montgomery County. And then this is percent change. So here you can really see again, the suburban counties or the concentric projected concentric growth that we're seeing around the urban cores. And when we look at the age structure projected, so if you look at the blue columns there, this is uh, the population in 2020 and our projected population for 2060. You can see the middle-aged population is the most significant. But if you look at the younger ages, you can see the age structure. If you just compare if you were to draw a line on the top of each of these columns, you would see that, essentially the age structure has gotten older for Texas and relatively fewer people. And again, this is largely a function of what I've been talking about in terms of declining birth rates. I should point out that said, it's also the migration is a significant factor in terms of our projected growth, and Texas will continue to grow. It's just we're likely to see a shift in terms of the age structure as a function of the declining birth rates. And then this kind of highlights, I guess, what I was just referring to. So you can kind of see the 2060 kind of the low. So this is percent change. or percent of the population in each one of these. And okay, I think that's it. And I'm sure I missed a few slides. So, so I think we'll have the slide deck will be up on our website. So if you want to find the slides that I might have missed at the beginning, you can go back and find those. So we have a few minutes for Q&A. If anybody has any questions or comments, be happy to entertain those. Yes. Question up here.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm with Texas 2036 here with my team. One of my biggest questions here is, out of all the information that you just delivered us today, what is the biggest takeaway you want everybody in this room to know and what we should look forward to in the future?
Well, hopefully I've already said that, but and I mean I have some concerns about the age structure, so I think I've highlighted that because that's something that there are a lot of uncertainties about what's going to happen going forward with birth rates and then also migration. I mean, so our growth is largely dependent on continued migration. It's not going to be on natural increase because we're going to see eventually with the baby boom age generation aging into high mortality years, lower birth rates. We're likely to see, natural decrease eventually for Texas. It's pretty far out before that happens, but if those trends continue long term, we'll see declining population from natural increase. And if migration isn't offsetting that, then we're certainly likely to see stabling or the growth kind of slowing significantly and maybe even declining if migration doesn't continue. So our projected population growth is largely driven by migration. And so there are a lot of things that can influence migration, but the most significant one is economics. And the economics are job creation, so people can come here and get jobs. Then there's also kind of the cost of living and various other things that kind of make Texas look attractive. We have jobs, we have a very affordable cost of living, and so people are moving here quite significantly.
Why don't you go ahead? Go back.
Over here on the right, my right.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. Colin McDonald, Texas Water Foundation. On the opposite side from births, it looks like you're also expecting people to live longer.
Yeah, I mean, certainly life expectancy is increasing. So, but it's kind of it's not something that kind of like all of a sudden everybody's going to live to be 106 years old. So change in life expectancy is a really slow process. It's not something that's going to happen very quickly. That said, and that's a good observation. I mean, we have the baby boom age generation, which generally speaking is probably healthier than the aged generation 2 decades ago, 4 decades ago. So the baby boom age generation is healthier and probably going to live longer than previous aged generations. But again, I don't anticipate we're going to see anything really dramatic that's going to kind of offset these declining birth rates that we're seeing. And that's something that is changing pretty quickly. I mean, you saw what's happened in just 10 years in terms of birth rates. Life expectancy might creep up a fraction of a year every few years or so. I mean, it's just really very small increases in life expectancy. Over here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sam Kelly with the Houston Chronicle.
Nice.
Good to meet you in person.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is universal for all of the, major cities, but at least in Houston, which is one of the top growing cities in the country, you're still seeing a decline in enrollment at the biggest, school district, HISD. And I'm wondering, in addition to declining birth rates, is that a function of the people who are moving to Houston maybe not having kids or having fewer kids? Like, yeah, where does that, I guess,
Yeah, I mean, I
relationship
think
come from?
certainly if you look at the areas where people are moving, well, again, not that many domestic migrants are moving into Houston. In fact, they're moving out. Um, and so those people that are moving in, generally speaking, will have kids. I mean, families that are moving into Texas tend to have kids. And then they're moving into the suburban ring counties. And so those are the places where we're seeing schools being built. I mean, so you're seeing, school districts growing in the suburban ring counties because all of a sudden there are kids there that weren't there last year or the year before. And they weren't born in Texas or weren't born in that place. And so that's certainly a factor. When we look at those areas 10 years from now, essentially the patterns that we're seeing in the urban cores are going to start, land use is going to be determined pretty definitively or long-term in those areas that are growing now. And once that's set, then there's not new housing that'll be built. And then those kids are going to age up and out of school. So we're likely to see, and the birth rates will continue to be low. So we're likely to see eventually, with the slowdown of domestic migration, you'll see, again, school districts probably being stressed in terms of enrollment. And that, again, that will filter its way up to post-secondary and the labor force as well. One more question?
Hi, thank you so much for a great presentation. I noticed that on the graph for infant mortality, your data was up to 2021. Do we have data available for the years after that?
I think we might be able to get 22 now. The final one is 2022,
Got
the
it.
most recent data that they've cleaned up and it's all ready. They have confidence in it now. But we'll be watching this going forward for sure. Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
we do want to stick on our schedule, so please know that, Dr. Potter will be here all day. So I encourage you to corner him when you can. And thank you all for your patience, with our presentation. And thank you, Dr. Potter, for, rolling with us. So sometimes we run into these technical challenges, but however, as he said, his PowerPoint slides will be available on our conference website for you. And as always, we at the Texas Demographic Center are happy to answer questions, provide additional information to you if you have questions about some of the data that we put out on our slides or through our social media accounts. So we are now going to transition to our next speaker, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Helen Yu, to introduce our next speaker. So we're going to get our slides up in a minute here, and we'll get started here shortly. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Helen Yu. I work at the Texas Demographic Center as the Associate Director and a Senior Demographer. But that's not important because I'm here now today and honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Pia Orrenius. Dr. Orrenius is a labor economist at the Federal Reserve Bank at Dallas, where she leads the regional and microeconomics group and serves as executive editor of Southwest Economy. She co-edited 10-Gallon Economy and co-authored Besides the Golden Door, focusing on her research on immigration and U.S. immigration policy. So I'm going to go off the script now. So as demographers, we often talk about migration, immigration, or maybe we talk about how much we don't know about migration, right? How much uncertainties we have in migration population growth. But I think everybody would agree, and that's also the comment made by Dr. Potter, that how closely related population growth or change is to economics, right? So that leads very well to our presentation next, the next presentation. So please join me to welcome Dr. Orrenius for her presentation.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be here today, and I always like to be wherever Dr. Potter is because I always learn from him. I'm sure that's why most of you are here too. Well, good morning. We'll talk about the Texas economic update. And so I'll try to stay neutral. I'm feeling a little pessimistic about the outlook. I'm going to try not to let it bleed through too much. I think it's all the uncertainty that's out there that kind of also colors some of the, worries that we have in the outlook, or at least that I have. All right, so let's do an overview and then we'll take you through some charts. I guess if you go to a conference with economists and demographers, it's death by charts for sure. Because I mean, you guys, but you know what you signed up for. All right, so Texas economy right now is relatively healthy as far as the sort of what we call the hard data is concerned. The job growth certainly has been robust so far this year. But the thing that's making us a little bit concerned are these real-time surveys that we run at the Dallas Fed of Texas businesses. And so we survey every month over 600 businesses, and almost 400 respond typically. And their outlooks really point to softening activity. So we think that growth is likely to slow here in the rest of the year in Texas to below trend. And the main reasons are tariffs and tariff uncertainty. They're going to lead to higher prices, and we think that is going to weaken consumption and investment. That may already be happening, but the data is not quite out yet. The data always comes with a lag, so we shall see how this is borne out. Lower immigration also, as we've been talking about this morning, is also a negative for growth, and government spending cuts, of course, provide additional challenges. And so I think both of those will lead to negative growth effects. Of course, on the other side, there are tax cuts, and really big tax cuts underway in Washington. And so, although most of those tax cuts are going to preserve the status quo, relative to the counterfactual, those tax cuts expiring, certainly you have to say, well, that's probably going to boost the economy to a certain extent, even though they do come with a lot of significant spending cuts. And then, of course, deregulation, to the extent that it occurs, could also be a tailwind. But there again, I'm seeing some caveats because, there's some deregulation, but there's also some regulation. So we'll see how much deregulation we get. So this is what I'm talking about here, the Texas Business Outlook Survey. So here, these are from the Dallas Fed, and they're showing it's a diffusion index. So if it's a positive category, that means growth. But if it's a lower positive number, that's slower growth. So we're seeing slower growth in the service sector, according to our revenue measure, and in the manufacturing sector, according to our production measure. So you can kind of see there that we're experiencing slower growth here after really what was a significant improvement at the end of last year and the very beginning of this year. But again, which is why we kind of pointing towards tariffs, early in the Trump administration that, influenced some of these measures. And the reason I say that, Texas is the #1 trading state in the nation. We have more exports and imports than any other state, including California, which is a much, much bigger state than we are, both in terms of population and GDP. But we are the most exposed to trade. And certainly the early talk of tariffs on Mexico, that was really big deal for us because such a significant share of our trade is with Mexico. But like I said, so here's kind of the hard data, soft data controversy. The job growth is looking really good this year so far. So that last bar there is 2.6% and, growth so far this year, annualized rate in Texas. So that's, far above the national so far, which is running at about 1.1% so far this year. Now, last year is what I look at, also to give me some pause, though, because last year, usually we grow about 1 percentage point faster in terms of job growth than the nation. But last year, we almost grew at the same pace as the nation. So, that was really unusual. I think, the problem is, I don't know if you've been reading about the employment data. We have had, after the pandemic, really large revisions to the employment data. And so, we've already revised that Texas data. That's one benefit with the Dallas Fed version of the Texas data. We've actually already revised it down because we do something called preliminary benchmarking. The U.S. data has not been revised. So I think by the time they revise that U.S. data for last year, it probably will come down some, maybe to 1%. But still, last year, in terms of the job growth data, at least, it wasn't the best year for Texas. So things, according to these data, again, they're looking much better this year. But again, are we going to have the kind of benchmark revisions we had last year? So that's kind of what's, again, giving me pause. So where are we seeing this job growth this year? So it's in oil and gas. You can see sort of the tallest kind of clear blue bars there on oil and gas, construction, and health. And so this is just comparing to 2024. So you can just see those are kind of the robust sectors in terms of growing at really high rates. Again, another thing that gives me pause here is that about half of health spending is government spending, right? Federal government spending is about half of that. So if some of those cuts go through, you're not going to see that kind of job growth in the health sector for sure. Construction, with the higher interest rates and with some of this industrial construction and manufacturing related construction ramping down, it was really boosted by the Inflation Reduction Act. It was boosted by the CHIPS Act. We'll see, new construction is not going to be boosted like that in the current environment. So we may see less growth than what you're seeing here going forward. And then oil and gas, oil prices have been coming down. So compared to last year. So they're down significantly from last year. So that's another, so like these, will this growth continue? I'm not so sure. The other thing I'm watching is the broader measures of the unemployment rate. So here we go. I mean, you can see the main headline unemployment rate here has not changed. It's still 4.1% for Texas, 4.2% for the US. So not much going on there. But if you take that broader unemployment rate, people have stopped looking, because they couldn't find a job, or people that, So a broader measure seems to be creeping up. And so that's giving us also some concern. All right. So certainly Dr. Potter has already really talked about migration. I just had some high level charts. We had, so this is net migration to Texas, whether it's domestic, broken out by domestic and international sources. And you can just see in 2022, 2023, and 2024, we had just amazing increases in international migration in particular. So this is really related to the migration surge. It's also the reason we're right now having a huge crackdown on migration, because basically, the border was essentially open, for 3 years. And, at least that's how I interpret the data. And so we estimate nationally, at least that we know of, 5.5 million people between 21 and 24. And we think that, Texas got at least 10% of those surge migrants that cross the border, mostly asylum seekers or people who got humanitarian parole. Anyway, so that really, really boosted our international migration numbers. And so that really contributed to population growth in Texas, as Dr. Potter was pointing out. The other concern I had, though, looking at this chart, was that, the domestic migration, which we really, in typical years, we rely on that more than international migration in Texas. And so you see that dropping off significantly in 2024. So that's kind of, consistent with that lower job growth. So maybe there is, maybe the reason we had less domestic migration is because we had less job growth last year. So that could be it. Anyway, so that bears watching, right? Because in the current environment, this international migration is going to be really reduced, right? So we're going to go back to a scenario where it's just really the typical legal migration, and there's not going to be a lot of asylum seekers. The refugee program is shut down, so we'll be really relying on domestic migration to grow in Texas. So it's going to be really bear watching, as Dr. Potter pointed out. It's important, this migration is important to the economy because it's labor force growth for us. Okay, so people, Florida has a lot of migration as well, but people move to Florida to retire. People move to Texas to work. Don't want to break your heart here, but they don't move here for the amenities. It's in the surveys. You ask, why did you move to Texas? Well, over half say, well, to work. Anyway, so we depend on these migrants for labor force growth. As you can see here, I'm just showing just how the outsized, very high rates of labor force growth that we have in Texas compared to places like Illinois, California, New York, or just even the national average. Even in our surveys at the Dallas Fed, we decided with the surge in international migration here in the last couple of years, we've run a few questions asking, over the past year, to what extent has your firm relied on hiring workers who moved to Texas from either a different state or a different country? And it was interesting that when we asked that question in February regarding 2024, you did see the increase in reliance on international migration in the data from our surveys. So that's consistent with the inflow that we've seen, especially across the border. So let's turn to another couple of sectors, construction and real estate. Let's look a little bit at construction. So I mentioned earlier, we've really had a national manufacturing construction boom, and it's manifested here in Texas to a bigger extent than elsewhere. So that black line in this chart is the Texas's share of non-residential building and non-building in the United States over time. And so it's a little bit hard to see the percent. Oh, you can see it on there. So, we are about 9% of the economy, but as you can see here in the last few years, in 2024, 16% of construction in this category. So we really got an outsized share of manufacturing construction under the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. So, we have several semiconductor fabs or factories, setting up, building and setting up in Texas. And that really is the green, kind of the green shaded bars or shapes. That's really the CHIPS Act. And then the red is power, gas, and communications. That's actually LNG. So that's these LNG exporting facilities that we're building along the Gulf Coast. So just tremendous amount of building in our state. That's partly related to things that are going to be unwound here going forward. So we don't expect this to continue to this extent. Data centers is certainly also part of the green there is data centers, and so we've also been a target or a destination for a lot of the data center construction that's kind of powering AI and other applications, the cloud, for example. And so that's really put added a lot of demand to electricity. So here I'm just showing electricity consumption in Texas, the amount of growth we've had and how more significant that is than in the US. So of course this precedes data centers. It's really about economic growth in general, but it's also about hot weather and certainly electrification in general, whether it's electric vehicles or electrification of of West Texas. The oil and gas fields are electrifying as well. So anyway, it's just interesting to see that for many years until very recently, electricity consumption wasn't even growing in the US, but it's been growing in Texas for a while. So, and we've been mostly good about accommodating that growth, of course, with a few important misses like Winter Storm Uri, which I shouldn't laugh because, it was kind of a tragic event for many. Okay, so what about the homes, single-family homes? The single-family housing market, and I think Dr. Potter was pointing out the importance of building, homes and building apartments. to accommodate the type of population growth that we're having. This is the only way to keep, house prices down and keep the affordability or some kind of affordability of housing for our growing population. So what's happening with home sales? Well, you can see that after really ballooning here in the green line, ballooning really in the pandemic, they've come down quite a bit. And then you can see this is existing homes, so it doesn't include the new homes. But now you can see that really housing markets are slowing in the sense that the mortgage rate in the red line there has really gone up. So it's a lot more expensive to get a loan to buy a house. And then, of course, the inventories are really kind of surging up. So they're at 5.5 months right now. So that's kind of so we see slowing housing markets, certainly. I think the good thing about what we're doing in Texas is that we are building a lot. Even though it's down from the pandemic highs, we do still build a lot more here than we do, than they do, for example, in other large states like California and New York, where the price of housing is considerably higher than here. So, but that kind of picture does portend, very little house price growth. And in fact, if you adjust, this is house price growth year on year using repeat sales data. So this is the most kind of reliable house price data that you can find. So you can see there that we have lower house price growth in Texas. And it's not because we have less growth, it's because we're building more. So that's a good thing. If you adjust this for inflation, you actually have, negative growth. You have falling house prices in real terms in the state already. So that's okay. I mean, most people bought, have their homes from before the pandemic, before that big run up. Everybody still typically has, not everybody, but the great majority of homeowners still have a lot of equity in their homes. So I think we're in good shape there. And I think that this kind of correction is important just to, again, after this huge run up, as you can see here in house prices in the pandemic or right after the pandemic, it's important that we get back to some kind of equilibrium in terms of house price growth so it doesn't get, too unaffordable. Rents do have come down in Texas. So this is rent growth, especially in Austin, that green line, you can see just how rent growth just blew up in the pandemic and then really came down and has been in negative territory here for the last couple of years. Again, this is not bad news. I think this is the adjustment to the fact that we built a lot of multifamily in the pandemic and that we're now sort of absorbing that excess multifamily because we have a lot of growth in the population. This should be a process that takes a couple of years, maybe, another year or so before these rents are stabilized in like the high growth areas like Austin. But again, it's not a bad correction. It's just sort of because it's come from the supply side. This is not something, rents are not falling because we don't have demand. It's rents are falling because we have a lot of supply. But you usually have to move to get the benefit of this rent. So, your landlord's not going to come up to you and like hand you a lower rent bill. So that's kind of the bad news. Okay, how are we doing on energy? So we have lower oil prices, as I told you earlier, and so that affects production. So here in the green line, in the black line, you can see that's Texas crude oil production. It's turned down a little bit in recent months. And again, that's just consistent with oil prices. And so, when we say things like drill, baby, drill, that's nice and everything. But when you talk to the oil and gas producers out in West Texas, they tell you what really matters is the oil price. And if the price is, if it's worth it, we'll drill more. If it's not worth it, we will not drill more. And that's pretty much, how it goes. And so you can see in blue there is the rig count. And so that's been pretty flat. And again, oil production is come down a little bit, but of course we've been at record levels of oil production. So that's impressive in its own right. Here is to the extent that the current oil price is kind of testing this, what energy producers call the break-even price. The break-even price is the price at which it's profitable to drill a new well. So at $63, I haven't checked today, but this is what it was yesterday. But this is actually a monthly price in the chart. But at $63 a barrel, we're right at the break-even price, the price at which it's worth, profitable to drill a new well. And so that's an really important gauge for this industry because, we're at oil prices now, and certainly, a couple weeks ago, they were in the 50s. So at those prices, there's not going to be more drilling activity. There's going to be less drilling activity. Okay, what about trade? So I mentioned tariffs before. We're worried about tariffs, and I think that's because in our surveys, the tariff effects are generally seen to be negative. So here we asked the same question in 2018 when we had kind of the first round of Trump tariff announcements. So do you expect higher tariffs to impact your business this year? And yeah, certainly they do. I mean, some don't know, and especially this time around, because of the magnitude of the tariffs and the fact that it's not just on China, but it's on most everyone. 59% of firms are saying it's going to affect their firm, and then it's going to be the great majority are saying it's going to be a negative impact. I think only something like 3% said a positive impact. I think that's that green slice is positive, and the red slice is the negative impact. Are businesses going to pass through the tariff increases to prices? So this is a really important question for the Fed, because of course the Fed is charged with maintaining, maximum employment, but also price stability. And so, if these tariffs are going to be passed through into, higher prices, well, that's a concern for the Fed since we're monitoring inflation. So here you can see that, yes, indeed, 26% of firms are saying they're going to pass through all of the tariff costs, and then, another 26% are saying most, and then, 41% are saying some. And so in general, we expect that these tariff increases will go through to prices. And they're going to go through very quickly, apparently, because we asked, what is the time frame for passing through tariff cost increases to customers? And so, holy moly, 22% said, as soon as they announce it, we're raising our prices. Another 29% said less than a month after the tariff takes effect. So basically, this is going to happen fast. Now, in all honesty, we haven't seen it yet in the CPI or other measures of inflation, so there really isn't much evidence of this. But certainly our surveys are telling us this. So, either, according to these surveys, it'll come, but we'll see. We haven't seen it yet. The inflation data has been pretty well behaved here in the last couple of months. Whoops. Definitely don't want to hear myself. Okay, so this is the outlook. So, this is, again, what's driving some of our concerns looking forward. So, again, going back to these Dallas Fed surveys, which are great because they're monthly, and so we get to see this type of evolution. So here we're looking at different diffusion indexes. So the blue one is future output. So, future investment is the future CapEx is the purple line. Future business activity is the red line, and then company outlook is the black line. And so what you see is, like, with the, when the Fed cut rates back in September for the, initial rate cut, there was some optimism in these gauges, and so they started moving up. And then with the election of President Trump, they continued to move up. There was a lot of optimism and around the election and the second Trump turn. But then, of course, I think with the talk of tariffs, I think that really backfired on Texas businesses in particular, just again, because we're so exposed to trade here. And so that really drove the expectations, for growth down, whether it was future output. So we really see how those gauges turn negative, or at least a lot less positive here in the last few months. The other thing that's really hurting Texas businesses is uncertainty. So, and I think consumers as well. And so these are the uncertainty gauge in our surveys. And so this is the uncertainty around the outlook has really spiked to, we've never seen these kinds of highs of uncertainty, reported by our businesses. When we ask businesses, what are your top concerns right now? And so what we last asked this question in March, and we had seen that initially with the election of Trump and so forth, that there was a lot less concern about recession. But then, of course, with the talk of tariffs, that we saw that red bar increase, and I've kind of circled it for you there. So now 50% of businesses rank demand, their lack of demand, as their biggest concern going forward. Here over the next few months, and so followed by these other measures here, including inflation. So those are kind of the things that are on the minds of Texas businesses moving forward. Our forecast is for 1.7% growth in 2025. So that is below the 2% long run trend. It's certainly not a recession number. We're not expecting a recession in Texas. We are expecting just below trend growth. So let me summarize. Job growth is robust, but really those sentiment-based measures are waning, as I showed you. Business leader optimism has faded, and economists have revised their forecasts down. Progress on inflation has slowed, and certainly the recession probability has risen. Inflation expectations are also up, and consumer confidence is down. In Texas, we're expecting resilient growth. That's our baseline case, but the risks are tilted to the downside on this forecast. So again, the headwinds are tariffs and certainly sharply lower immigration, the rollback of federal government spending, and although there's not going to be any, on the whole, it's not going to be less federal government spending. I mean, there will, I guess, well, there's going to be higher deficits, let's say that. But certainly the federal government spending on Medicaid programs, on, the safety net, and the things that we rely on, especially in Texas, some of that spending is being cut. And then, of course, lower oil prices is something that we're watching. And then again, the tailwinds for growth are deregulation and tax cuts. And again, in Texas, we're fortunate because the state's robust business climate and our budget surplus and our rainy day fund. Those are all things that can bolster our outlook here in Texas in particular. And we've got some some optimistic, some things coming out of the legislature, like more spending on schools and so forth. That's going to be helpful. And that's all I had.
Thank you, Dr. Orrenius, for the great presentation. We do have some time for a Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll come by and bring you a mic. Jeff.
Jacob Jimenez was the Workforce Solutions for North Central Texas. So with the lower migration numbers coming, do you think that's going to affect the construction industry? And what is that job outlook for the construction sector?
Yeah, that's a good point. On the construction, I was seeing the higher interest rates are going to hurt, especially if they're going to be higher for longer because inflation, the inflation outlook isn't as positive as it used to be. But then, of course, what you're pointing out is on the supply side in terms of the labor that goes into construction. There may be workforce shortages there as a result of the decline in immigration, particularly the type of border migration that we've seen here in the last few years. And I think that's, it's a fair assessment. What I think may happen, though, is that construction may slow as the labor force slows as well in terms of, so they may be slowing in tandem, really both demand and supply. And so we may, it may stabilize. So, because I think that construction will slow because we've just had such a huge boom in construction. It's gotta come down. And so if the workforce growth is coming down along with the activity, then that's, I guess, that lets you keep kind of a balance there.
Good morning, Lila Valencia with the City of Austin. I was wondering, when you were showing the trends in domestic migration and international migration, and then you referenced sort of the tariffs of 2018, that migration mix looked really similar to maybe what could happen in 2018, right? It was like really low domestic migration, really low international migration. Should we be looking at 2018 to kind of get a sense of what maybe 2025 might look like in terms of those migration mixes? And if not, what's the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of, yeah, because international immigration was pretty low, I think, in 2018. So that might be a good guide. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a good baseline. I don't know, Dr. Potter, if you think that might be reasonable, that might be a reasonable benchmark. Yeah, because we do kind of need to think about what it's going to look like in the future. Because again, we're not going to have this. We're not going to have this again. This outsized international immigration is going to go away. And we hope to preserve, again, that domestic migration, especially to this region, if we hope to grow or continue to grow like we're used to growing. And so, but yeah, I think that's probably a good baseline.
Hi, Luna Chanthano with Texas A&M University. Thank you for that. You spoke a little bit about the CHIPS Act in your presentation, and I was wondering if you could comment on whether you expect semiconductor manufacturing to increase here in Texas in the coming years.
Yes, absolutely. It's going to increase. I mean, they're building those facilities now. So yeah, it's going to be a huge increase. Because what I showed you was manufacturing construction. And so they're not operating yet, I don't think. And so whether it's in Taylor, Texas, or it's in Sherman, we have at least 2 huge ones, and there may even be 3. So as those come online, really in the next 5 to 10 years, yeah, there's going to be a significant increase. Will they compete in terms of with respect to the oil and gas industry? Gosh, that's a good question. I haven't thought about that. Certainly not in terms of jobs, I wouldn't think, because it's a pretty automated, process, the semiconductor manufacturing. In terms of GDP, yeah, I'd have to look at it. I don't want to venture a guess and then be wrong. But it certainly is. I mean, it's a positive development. I mean, I hope, certainly in terms of having the supply chain kind of, secure. I just don't know what it's going to do to the cost of chips. That's a whole nother question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm from Bloomberg News. I was wondering, in combination with what Dr. Potter was talking about, with how Harris County, some of our urban counties have had domestic out-migration, and they've been reliant on immigration. With immigration declining, do you expect that to impact our urban cores more so than the rings? And, how do you see that playing out?
Absolutely. Yeah. Just look at like what happened in California in the pandemic when international immigration totally dried up. They had, population decline. The only reason population grows in California is because of international immigration, because people are leaving that state. So, if you just bring that same reasoning to any other location, you'll see the similar thing. So in Houston, without the international immigration, you have domestic out migration. They're migrating out to sort of the suburban core that Dr. Potter was talking about, or the suburban ring, if you will, then yeah, there's not going to be growth.
Thanks.
I actually had a question about your slides and now they're gone. But on slide 13, you were comparing Texas and the US in terms of energy consumption. Do you remember if that comparison for the US was like a median or an average? I was kind of curious about the underlying data of it.
It's total and
Okay.
it's indexed to show the growth.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting because in the US as a whole, apparently electricity consumption hasn't grown for decades. And that's because of efficiency and the offshoring of manufacturing. So we've offshored a lot of manufacturing in the early 2000s, right? And then made a lot more efficient appliances. And so despite the growth in the population and GDP growth, electricity consumption in the US as a whole has been flat for decades. It's just now started to increase. And so that's why in the US as a whole, they're really nervous about how do they accommodate growth. Nice thing about Texas is we've been growing so much faster. I mean, we've actually had increase, we've had growth in electricity consumption over time. So now that it's growing even a little bit faster, I mean, at least I feel like we're kind of used to accommodating growth in electricity consumption. Although again, we have a little bit of ways to go in terms of ensuring the reliability of that electricity. So
Yeah, I was also going to kind of ask about the increased demand on renewable energy as well. But if there's any.
Yeah, I mean, that's how Texas did it.
Yeah.
That's the secret.
Mhm.
We did it by a huge investment in wind and more recently solar. Yeah,
Mhm.
utility solar and wind. I mean, we're number one in wind. I think we're number one or number two in utility solar in the nation. But yeah, something like a quarter of our electricity production comes from wind. So, and then an additional, I don't know, 5–10% from solar. So we're huge in renewables.
Yeah.
And that's the only way that we were able to grow while keeping prices low of electricity. We still have below average prices compared to the nation. We're below the nation in terms of electricity prices. And that's the beauty of the renewable sources. The problem with the renewable sources is that, the wind is not always blowing and the sun is not always shining. So you have to make these contingency plans for the grid to make sure that you're consistently supplying electricity, right, to households, even in extreme weather. So that's what we're learning right now, how to do that. But so that's why people now are saying, hey, we need everything. Because when, renewables are not available, then we need batteries, we need natural gas plants. So that's kind of where we are.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jason Remain with Dallas County. One of your slides mentioned like firms, there's been an increased reliance on, I guess, immigrant workers, right? So I'm wondering specifically for the urban counties, what impact would that have? I guess if there is a decrease in migration, but these firms are relying on immigrants, so.
Yeah, I mean, the economy should adjust. I mean, there's a number of ways in which hopefully it will adjust. I mean, one way maybe that wages, could have to, in some cases, wages may have to increase to try to lure some of the existing workforce into certain positions. I think, but part of that is going to be accommodating slower growth, maybe and less hiring than we had in the past. I mean, when you have immigration, it's interesting. You have a larger workforce, but you also have increases in demand because they themselves, because they live here, are consuming goods and services. And so when you have less immigration, you have less labor supply, but you also have less consumer demand. So the whole economy kind of shifts down to a lower gear of growth. So I guess maybe that'll even this out some. The other thing that governments can do, and so there's other things like you can try to spur labor force participation among the existing workforce, among Native workers, people who are already here. And so you can do that with, a number like, I don't know, maybe, no tax on overtime. Maybe that's, means people are going to work more hours, for example, or you could provide childcare. More childcare, not less childcare, more childcare. And that may, free up the women's labor supply, for example. So there's other reforms you can do to encourage labor force participation when there's less immigration.
Kind of a follow-up with labor force. So I remember seeing the increase in labor force participation among older folks, especially before the pandemic. I haven't looked at the number recently. Are we seeing them? I know during pandemic, a lot of these older population kind of exit the labor force. Have they come back? Do you see anything differences among different race ethnic groups in that sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't looked recently, but I know sort of the historical trends that you're referring to is like prior to the pandemic is that with just falling labor force participation among young people, especially, like kids, we all kind of grew up working. I don't know if you're my age, but nowadays, less than a third of young adults, or teenagers, work while they're in school, for example. So that's become very unusual. At the same time, we saw labor force participation really rise among the elderly And that's because they're healthier, right? They're healthier, and so they live longer, and so they're able to work longer. Sorry for them.
That's what I'm saying, you know, maybe
This sucks.
one way to do that is to, you know, increase the labor force participation.
Yes, that's a good point, Helen. Yeah, exactly. That's one way to, yeah, don't let those guys retire. Yeah, work forever. No, but yes. But we did lose a big chunk of people in the pandemic, and I think that retired early also. And so I don't know if they're, you know, if they'll come back or not. That may, you know, it's going to depend on the economy as well. You know, how we do going forward.
Other questions anywhere? I will ask one, so we have a few minutes. In your surveys, have you all, you know, approached the question of AI in the workforce, and what are you hearing?
Oh, actually, we're running those questions this month, and I haven't seen the results yet. So when I go to the office today, I'll see those results, and they'll be posted on Monday. No, Monday's Memorial Day. Tuesday, we'll post those. We're asked special questions about AI, and we've asked them before, and so we're kind of looking at this one. This time, we're asking specifically about Gen AI and not just AI in general, and so we'll see how those come back. But kind of what we've noticed with our questions is that maybe about a quarter of firms are using Gen AI in our survey. And then I think either it was total AI or Gen AI. I can't remember exactly. But and then, but I think, you know, in terms of was it impacting, it was impacting productivity. They said it was productivity enhancing, but they said also it wasn't really allowed. I think only 10% of firms said it allowed them to decrease employment. And I think, you know, some other substantial fraction said they were actually increasing employment, you know, to learn to use AI and to accommodate AI. And so the impact on employment wasn't clear. And then we also have measures of like what skill of worker is being most impacted by AI. And so, yeah, there's some interesting results there. And so we'll see on Tuesday what they are, you know, for this last round. But I know, you know, there's quite a bit of concern out there in terms of just how it's going to impact workers. I mean, certainly, I think everyone kind of agrees it'll increase productivity by some degree. I'm not sure. Some people say by a lot. Some say, you know, by a little. But I think the general sense is how is it going to impact employment? And I think that's, you can look at a couple of occupations and kind of say, it looks like, you know, the timing of the decrease in employment of, say, you know, writers or copy editors or, you know, people in advertising and marketing, you know, it looks like it's coincident with AI and Gen AI in particular, but, you know, it's hard to say still.
Hope y'all can join me in thanking Dr. Orrenius for this presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Potter. Great. All right. We are about time for a break. We have sessions starting at 11. I did just want to reminder, if you hadn't noticed, in the back of your name tag is our digital agenda. So you'll see what sessions are being offered in what rooms. Our 11 o'clock session will be here. Water, Wi-Fi, and workforce will be in this room. The other workshops are in the conference rooms across the hallway. We will have lunch in the north lobby. It's the box lunch. This room will be open during the lunch hour so that you can come and have your lunch here, but there's lots of spaces around the conference center for you to sit and enjoy your lunch. We're here to answer any other questions, and I guess it's all ready for break. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much for that.
Oh, sure.
Full information.
Oh, okay, good. Hope it was helpful.
It was. So you have worked with several members of my team, like
Yeah.
Peggy Fikak,
Yeah.
the fiscal notes editor.
Yeah.
And so.
Oh, yeah, right. On the article. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I was hoping, I don't have any article in the works where I would reach out to you as a source, but would it be possible to get your contact information?
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah, reach out. And I just talked to another group. Some of you guys were working on an article about nearshoring. I don't know what happened with that.
Here's the other mic.
You can leave it at that.
Okay.
So what we're gonna do is move the podium.